Not every movie is meant to be loved. Some films fail quietly and forgotten within weeks of release. Others fail loudly, becoming punchlines, cautionary tales, or infamous disasters that people talk about for years. And then there are the films that earn the full force of criticism from one of cinema's most respected voices, Roger Ebert. Ebert wasn't just harsh for the sake of it. When he disliked a movie, it usually meant something deeper had gone wrong. Storytelling, tone, execution, or sometimes all of the above. But what makes these films fascinating is that they didn't just fail, they left a mark. Some became cult curiosities, others became legendary for all the wrong reasons, and a few are still debated today. These are the movies that made even Ebert lose his patience. North, there are bad reviews. And then there's what Ebert wrote about North. His reaction to the film is still remembered as one of the most brutally honest critiques ever published. It wasn't just dislike, it was complete disbelief that the movie existed in the form that it did. Directed by Rob Reiner, the film follows a young boy who decides to divorce his parents and search the world for better ones. It's a premise that could have worked as a heartfelt or imaginative story. Instead, it becomes something far stranger. The film jumps from country to country, presenting exaggerated cultural stereotypes as humor. What might have been intended as playful comes across as awkward and uncomfortable. Ebert's main issue wasn't just that the jokes didn't land, it was that the film seemed to misunderstand its own tone. Moments that should feel emotional feel forced, comedy that should feel light feels clumsy, and the entire journey never quite finds a reason to exist beyond its concept. Even the cast, which includes major names, can't bring coherence to the material. Over time, North hasn't been reevaluated in the same way some other critical failures have. Instead, it remains a kind of benchmark, a reminder of how even talented filmmakers can miss completely. In Ebert's review, still quoted to this day as one of the most savage takedowns in film criticism history, Freddy Got Fingered. Some movies are bad. Others feel like they're actively challenging the audience to keep watching. Freddy Got Fingered, starring Tom Green, falls firmly into the second category. When it was released, Ebert didn't just dislike it, he seemed genuinely baffled by it. He described it as one of the worst experiences he had ever had watching a film. The movie follows a man-child cartoonist whose behavior becomes increasingly absurd and, at times, intentionally uncomfortable. But here's the thing, that discomfort is the point. Tom Green's style of comedy has always leaned toward chaos, shock value, and pushing boundaries just to see how far he can go. And this film takes that philosophy to the extreme. Scenes feel random, jokes feel deliberately excessive. The structure barely resembles a traditional narrative. To some viewers, that made it unbearable. To others, strangely fascinating. Because beneath the chaos, there's an argument that the film is intentionally anti-comedy, a satire of the very idea of studio filmmaking. Ebert, however, didn't see it that way at the time. For him, it was simply an exhausting experience that tested the limits of patience. And yet, years later, the film has gained a strange kind of cult following, precisely because of how aggressively it refuses to behave like a normal movie. Deuce Bigalow. European Gigolo sequels often struggle to recapture what made the original work, but Deuce Bigalow. European Gigolo didn't just struggle, it became one of Ebert's most memorable targets. Starring Rob Schneider, the film continues the story of a male escort navigating bizarre situations across Europe. The humor leans heavily on shock value, exaggerated stereotypes, and crude jokes. For Ebert, the problem wasn't just that the film was vulgar, it was that it lacked creativity. He felt the jokes were lazy, repetitive, and built entirely around the same ideas without adding anything new. What made the situation even more famous was the response. After Ebert's harsh review, Rob Schneider publicly criticized him, leading to a back and forth that became part of movie review history. The film itself quickly faded from mainstream attention, but the controversy surrounding it didn't. Today, Deuce Bigalow, European Gigolo, is remembered less for its story and more for the critical storm it created. A reminder that sometimes the reaction to a film can become more interesting than the film itself. Jaws, The Revenge. There are disappointing sequels, and then there's Jaws, The Revenge. Following the massive success of Jaws, expectations were already complicated for any continuation of the story. But this fourth installment took things in a direction that many, including Ebert, found impossible to take seriously. The premise suggests that the shark is somehow targeting the same family across different locations, not just attacking randomly, but seeking revenge. That idea alone became a major point of criticism because it shifts the film from suspense into something almost unintentionally absurd. Instead of tension, audiences found themselves questioning the logic of what they were watching. Even the iconic sense of fear that defined the original film is missing here. The atmosphere feels thinner. The stakes feel less convincing, and the shark itself, once a symbol of unseen terror, becomes harder to take seriously. Ebert's reaction reflected that frustration. For him, the film represented a loss of what made the original powerful. Instead of building on suspense and storytelling, it leaned into repetition without purpose. Mad Dog Time, there are films that are confusing, and then there are films that feel empty. That was very much Roger Ebert's experience with Mad Dog Time. His now famous description compared watching the film to waiting for a bus that never comes. Not because something terrible keeps happening, but because nothing meaningful happens at all. On paper, the movie sounds promising. A crime story filled with gangsters, power struggles, and a cast packed with recognizable names. It should feel tense, stylish, maybe even dangerous. Instead, it feels oddly lifeless. Scenes unfold without urgency. Conversations stretch without purpose. Characters talk, but rarely say anything that moves the story forward. The film creates the illusion of importance without actually delivering it. And that's what frustrated Ebert the most. It's not aggressively bad in the way some movies are. It's not chaotic or shocking. It's simply stagnant. There's a strange stillness to everything, as if the film is waiting for something to happen but never quite gets there. Over time, Mad Dog Time has become something of a curiosity. People don't revisit it because it's entertaining. They revisit it because of the reputation it built, largely thanks to that unforgettable review. And in a strange way, that reputation has given the film a second life. Not as a hidden gem, but as a reminder that sometimes the absence of energy can be just as noticeable as its excess. I Spit on Your Grave. Some films don't just divide audiences, they deeply unsettle them. I Spit on Your Grave is one of the most controversial films ever discussed by Roger Ebert. His reaction wasn't just negative, it was moral. He described the film as deeply unpleasant and questioned the purpose behind what it was showing. For him, it crossed a line, not because of its subject matter alone, but because of how that subject matter was presented. The story follows a writer who retreats to a remote cabin only to become the victim of brutal violence. And what follows is a revenge narrative that has sparked decades of debate. Some viewers interpret the film as a harsh commentary on violence and justice. Others see it as exploitative, focusing more on shock than meaning. Ebert firmly leaned toward the latter. He argued that the film lingered too long on suffering, turning something serious into something uncomfortable in a way that didn't feel justified. And that's what makes this film different from others on the list. It's not just about quality, it's about intent. Over the years, the conversation around I Spit on Your Grave has evolved. Some critics have revisited it with new perspectives. Others maintain the original concerns. But one thing hasn't changed. It remains one of the most difficult films to discuss, and one of the most polarizing. The Brown Bunny. Not every harsh review stays permanent. The Brown Bunny is one of the rare cases where Roger Ebert actually changed his mind. When the film first premiered, Ebert publicly criticized it strongly. His initial reaction was shaped by an early version of the film that felt slow, unfocused, and emotionally distant. But something unusual happened. The director Vincent Gallo later re-edited the film, and Ebert revisited it. This time his response was different. He acknowledged that the new version was more effective, more emotionally coherent, more focused in its storytelling. That shift doesn't mean the film became universally loved. It remains a quiet, minimal, and at times challenging experience. The story follows a motorcycle racer traveling across the country, carrying emotional weight that slowly reveals itself through silence and reflection. Now, there's very little dialogue, very little explanation, and that's part of what makes it difficult for some viewers. But it also shows something important about criticism. Even strong opinions can evolve. Even harsh reactions can soften when context changes. And The Brown Bunny stands as one of the most interesting examples of that evolution. Showgirls. Some movies fail and then come back in a completely different way. Showgirls is one of the clearest examples of that transformation. Directed by Paul Verhoeven, the film was heavily criticized upon release. Audiences and critics, including Roger Ebert, reacted strongly to its tone, performances, and storytelling choices. At the time, it was seen as excessive, awkward, and difficult to take seriously. The story follows a young woman chasing fame in the world of Las Vegas entertainment, a setting filled with ambition, competition, and illusion. But the film's style is what made it stand out. Everything is heightened. The performances feel exaggerated. The emotions feel intense. The world feels artificial. And that's exactly why it didn't connect with audiences at first. But over time, something changed. People began revisiting Showgirls with a different perspective. Instead of seeing it as a failed drama, some began interpreting it as satire. A bold, exaggerated look at fame, power, and performance. Midnight screenings started appearing. Fans began quoting lines. The film developed a cult following. It didn't become universally respected, but it became something else, reevaluated. And that's what makes it fascinating, because sometimes the films that are rejected the loudest are the ones that come back in the most unexpected ways. Not every movie earns praise. Some earn confusion, some earn criticism, and some earn outright rejection. But even the worst films have something to offer. If not as great storytelling, then as lessons, curiosities, or cultural moments that reveal how unpredictable cinema can be. What Roger Ebert understood better than most was that movies matter, even when they fail. Because failure, in its own way, tells a story too. It shows what doesn't work, what goes too far, or what simply misses the mark entirely. And sometimes, those failures become just as memorable as success, not because they were great, but because they were impossible to ignore. And years later, we're still talking about them, which might be the strangest kind of legacy a film can have.